Everyone sees the United States as the world's unstoppable machine, a superpower that seems to run on its own. The biggest economy, the strongest military, a nation that looks completely self-reliant. But what if that machine depends on a single gear right next door? And that gear, the one keeping it all running, is Canada. From Michigan's highways to Texas refineries, from New York's homes to California's crops, everything runs on what starts far to the north. Canada supplies 60% of America's imported oil, 85% of its fertilizers, and most of its lumber. Over $3.5 billion in goods cross the border each day. This isn't a friendly trade relationship. It's a hidden dependency that keeps the American system alive. This is the story of the empire that thought it stood alone, until you look north and see who's really holding it up. And to understand why, we need to look beneath the surface, at the hidden systems that connect both nations. When you walk through the food aisles of any American supermarket, you'd think everything you see is produced locally. Fruits, meats, grains, vegetables. It all seems to come from that vast sea of farmland that defines the agricultural heart of the United States. It's easy to assume that such a rich country, with so much land, technology, and resources, can feed its own population without any outside help. But that perception is false, because it leaves out a fact that most people don't know. Modern agriculture doesn't run only on land and water, it runs on chemistry. And at the center of that chemistry is potash, a fertilizer made from potassium. Without it, crops don't grow well, plants don't absorb water properly, they don't develop strong roots, and they can't resist disease. In other words, without potash, the fields don't produce. The United States imports about 93% of all the potash it uses, and more than 85% of that comes from Canadian mines in Saskatchewan, a region little known outside Canada, but home to more than 30% of the world's reserves of the strategic mineral. But the dependence on Canada isn't just about volume. It's about stability, scale, and logistics. The other major producers of potash are Russia and Belarus, two countries that are under sanctions, politically unstable, and closely allied. China, on the other hand, has significant reserves, but imposes strict export limits because its top priority is supplying its own population. Even though the US has some domestic production, its mines are less competitive, more expensive to operate, and can't respond quickly to spikes in demand. That's why Canada is essential. It's a reliable, nearby supplier, and the only one truly capable of supporting the US agricultural system without interruptions. Without Canadian potash, the entire food supply chain would be affected within weeks. And what today seems unthinkable, a food shortage in one of the world's biggest farming powers, could start to become a reality. Without Canadian potash, there's no American food. And without Canadian lumber, there are no houses. Homes in the United States aren't built with bricks. They're built with softwood planks, a type of wood that is light, strong, and versatile, and comes from conifers like spruce, pine, and fir. The US produces some of this wood, especially in states like Oregon, Washington, Georgia, and parts of the South, but demand is higher than domestic supply. And on top of that, the quality and price of Canadian lumber make it very attractive. That's why more than 80% of the softwood imported by the US comes from Canada, and it represents about 30% of total national consumption. Each year, about 50 million cubic meters of Canadian lumber cross the border into the United States, the equivalent of 1.5 million fully loaded logging trucks. It's a resource that directly affects housing prices, the ability to build infrastructure, job creation, and urban growth. In a country already facing a housing crisis, this dependence is no small thing. Canadian lumber is a stabilizer for the American housing market and supports a large part of the construction economy. On a macroeconomic level, Canadian softwood makes urban expansion cheaper, lowers the starting costs of thousands of projects, and allows medium-sized cities to grow quickly and efficiently. Most importantly, there is no easy substitute. Southern US trees don't offer the same quality, and the northern forests are already overused. Trying to find new suppliers comes with logistical hurdles, higher costs, and delivery times that don't match the scale and speed of the US market. Canada doesn't just feed and shelter its southern neighbor, it also keeps it running, quite literally, because the next link in this chain of dependence flows through the continent itself: water. At first glance, it might seem like an exaggeration because the United States has big rivers, dams, and its own aquifers. But what many people don't see is that in the industrial Northeast, the most productive region of the country, Canadian water is a key piece of the system. Let's start with the Great Lakes, the largest surface freshwater reserve on Earth. 5 giant lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, that together with the St. Lawrence River form a waterway more than 2,300 miles long. A real aquatic corridor that connects the industrial heart of North America with the Atlantic Ocean. Cargo ships pass through it carrying grain, steel, coal, chemicals, and machinery. And even though a large part of this network runs through U.S. territory, navigation and water flow control depend heavily on infrastructure managed by Canada. Canada manages access to Lake Ontario through the Cornwall Canal and also controls entry to Lake Erie from the Niagara side. But the key piece is the Welland Canal. It's an impressive Canadian engineering project that allows ships to climb nearly 100 meters in elevation between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Without this canal, cargo ships simply couldn't cross the region and reach the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence River, the final stretch of the system. That's where 40% of U.S. maritime trade exits to the ocean. And although the river flows through shared zones, decisions about water levels, dredging, and maintenance mostly depend on Canadian authorities. But the importance of Canadian water isn't only about transportation. The Great Lakes system provides water for drinking, for crop irrigation, for powering industries, and for cooling power plants. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago couldn't function without this water balance. And that balance doesn't maintain itself. It depends on binational agreements, constant monitoring, and the joint operation of locks, gates, canals, and water flow control systems. A significant part of that infrastructure is on Canadian soil. In other words, the United States cannot guarantee water balance in its most densely populated and most productive region without the infrastructure and technical cooperation of its northern neighbor. It's a relationship built on agreements, on stability, and on trust. And above all, on geography. This shared geography created something even deeper than trade. It built an industrial ecosystem that no longer has a border. Because Canada isn't just a supplier, it's part of the American production line. There's a whole network of factories, assembly plants, workshops, and suppliers in Canada that produce parts, components, and finished products that then cross the border to keep the US supply chain running. A car assembled in Detroit might have an engine made in Ontario, a steering system built in Quebec, electronic sensors developed in Toronto, and body panels stamped in Manitoba. And the same thing happens with heavy machinery and many other industries. The case of aluminum is especially telling. Canada is the largest supplier of aluminum to the United States, especially for sectors like automotive, aviation, and construction. Even though aluminum is lightweight and easy to transport, its production requires massive amounts of hydroelectric power, something Canada has in abundance and at low cost. That energy advantage makes Canadian aluminum irreplaceable for the US production system. The whole setup works like one giant factory spread across 2 countries. And that's not a coincidence. Starting with the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 and later reinforced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the 3 countries built a complementary manufacturing relationship. They don't compete, they produce what the other needs to function. And while this model has brought big benefits to both sides, it's also created a structural dependence that very few people talk about. Because if, for any reason, the industrial flow between Canada and the United States were interrupted, hundreds of US factories would have to shut down within days. This isn't just a hypothetical scenario. In 2020, when pandemic border restrictions interrupted commercial traffic, several automotive plants in the US had to halt production. Canada isn't an external supplier, it's part of the American system. And if we're talking about dependence, we can't forget energy, because a crucial part of America's energy supply comes from the north. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of oil to the United States, far ahead of Saudi Arabia, Mexico, or any other country. Almost 60% of all the oil the US imports comes from Canada, mainly from Alberta, where the massive oil sands are located. They hold the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world. This heavy crude flows to refineries in Illinois, Oklahoma, and the Gulf of Mexico through a pipeline network that includes the Enbridge and Keystone systems. What's interesting is that this type of crude is perfect for refineries already designed for heavy oil. You can't just shut off the Canadian supply and replace it with local or lighter oil. You'd have to modify entire infrastructures. But there's something else important to understand. A large part of the oil extracted in Canada cannot easily be sent elsewhere. For decades, Canada didn't have direct, large-scale access to the Pacific Ocean, which made it almost impossible to export that oil to Asia. Even though the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was recently completed, capacity is still limited. This means that the United States doesn't just need Canadian oil, it also has it locked in. It's a relationship of interdependence. But beyond oil, Canada exports large amounts of natural gas to northern US states, accounting for 90% of the natural gas the US imports. In winter, this gas flow is essential to heat homes, hospitals, schools, and factories. While the United States produces a lot of its own gas, the North American network is so interconnected that Canadian gas is often the cheapest and most reliable option for certain border states. And beyond oil and gas, one of the least known aspects of this energy relationship is electricity. Canada exports between 50 and 60 terawatt-hours of hydroelectric power and supplies millions of American homes through long-term contracts that guarantee clean, stable, and cheap electricity. This kind of energy doesn't just help diversify the energy mix, it also reduces dependence on fossil fuels, stabilizes the electrical grid during critical moments, and helps many states meet environmental goals without building new dams. But there's another form of energy that connects Canada and the US in a strategic way: uranium. Canada is one of the largest uranium producers in the world, and a big part of that uranium powers US nuclear plants, which still produce about 18% of the country's electricity. This fuel is refined, processed, and shipped to reactors all across the US, providing a stable energy base in regions where other sources aren't viable. What's striking is that even though the US has its own uranium reserves, it still heavily depends on Canadian uranium to keep its reactors running. The factories in the industrial belt, the homes in the Northeast, the hospitals in the Midwest, the data centers on the East Coast, they all use, directly or indirectly, some of the energy that flows from Canada. It's an energy synapse between two production systems that, even though they're separated by a border, work like one single organism. And if oil, gas, and uranium were the pillars of development in the 20th century, today the key is critical minerals. Elements like lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and rare earths. These don't just power factories, they power entire technologies. From electric vehicles and batteries to satellites, wind turbines, microchips, smartphones, and defense systems. Even though the United States has one of the most advanced tech industries in the world, its access to critical minerals is limited, and more importantly, highly dependent on countries with complex relationships. China, for example, controls more than 70% of the global processing of rare earths, and a large part of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a politically unstable country with reports of child labor. Canada, on the other hand, offers a reliable, allied, stable source rich in strategic minerals. More than 30 minerals considered critical by the US Department of Energy are found in significant quantities in Canadian territory. They make Canada a key piece of the North American industrial puzzle. In recent years, US companies and even the federal government have started investing directly in Canadian mines, processing plants, and exploration projects. One of the most important cases is lithium, where several US companies are helping fund new mines in Quebec and Ontario to reduce dependence on Asia. The same is happening with nickel, essential for making high-density batteries. In 2022, Tesla signed a deal with Vale Canada Limited to get sustainably mined nickel from Ontario, a factor that is becoming more and more valuable in the global supply chain. And this pattern is repeating with graphite, cobalt, scandium, and other rare earths. Without Canadian minerals, there's no green transition in the United States, no tech independence, and no sustainable defense capacity. And many of the most advanced factories would come to a halt. And that dependence doesn't end with factories or technology. It reaches something far more fundamental: the ability to defend the continent itself. North America's air defense isn't built just on missiles, planes, or satellites. It's built on an invisible shield made of radars, sensors, and early warning stations that detect any threat before it's too late. And in that system, location is everything. Technically, a large part of that defense depends on NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, a binational military alliance created in 1958 between the US and Canada. Its job is to detect, track, and respond to any unidentified airborne object approaching the continent from any direction, especially from the Arctic. Because if an intercontinental ballistic missile were launched from Russia or any northern base, the most direct path to US territory would be over the North Pole. And that's where Canada comes in, with its installations designed to see what no radar on US soil could detect in time. But this isn't just about nuclear threats. It also includes unidentified aircraft, strategic bomber incursions, spy balloons, drones, or even civilian planes off course. The infrastructure is operational, maintained, coordinated, and synchronized daily between the two countries. NORAD officers work together at bases like Cheyenne Mountain and Colorado Springs, but they rely on eyes watching from the top of the world. And while the general public rarely thinks about it, the people who design national defense strategy know very well that this partnership isn't just symbolic. It's structural. If it breaks, the US doesn't just lose an ally, it loses the ability to see what's coming. The myth of self-sufficiency built an empire. But what actually sustains a civilization is interdependence you rarely see. Fertilizers beneath the soil, timber in the walls, water in the locks, power in the grid, and a radar line across the Arctic night. The United States looks like the muscle, but the structure that keeps it standing runs through Canada. This isn't charity or convenience, it's architecture. A binational design where food, housing, industry, energy, minerals, and defense are one continuous system. Fragile not because it is weak, but because it relies on trust, timing, and geography working in sync. And that leaves us with a deep question. Can a superpower be truly sovereign in a world where resilience depends on an ally's pipelines, canals, grids, and early warning eyes? If Canada paused, even briefly, the American machine would stall. So the real measure of strength isn't how loudly a country claims its independence, but how wisely it safeguards the partnerships that make its independence possible. The United States may be the headline, but Canada is the backbone. And the future of North America will be decided by how well that backbone is understood, respected, and kept unbroken. That's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, don't miss the next one.